Welcome back to the show. We are joined today by Alastair Crooke, a former British and EU diplomat. And I would advise everyone to follow his Substack, Conflicts Forum, and I will make sure to leave a link in the description. So thank you very much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to your program. Thank you.
So we see now that the US and Europe find themselves increasingly divided. This is, of course, very evident as well with the war in Ukraine. That is, the US is pushing Zelensky to accept concessions for the peace agreement, while the Europeans appear to be encouraging Zelensky to resist. So you used to be a negotiator. You worked for the EU leadership as well. How do you make sense of this? Because if Ukraine is now unraveling and a collapse without a peace settlement would be a disaster, how do you make sense of the position? I'm always asked why there's such a fierce resistance to accept any conditions or concessions.
Well, first thing I would say is, that if Europe is solidly against Trump's position, undoubtedly that there are certain factions in Washington that are giving that a green light. I don't think, in my experience, these things don't happen out of the blue, that you have all of the European Union taking a stand on Trump's proposals for Ukraine, nor do you really have the Europeans almost to a person calling for war with Russia. No, those are two separate issues, perhaps, and we can deal with them sort of separately. But I think if you ask what happened and what was why, you can go far back to the 19th century and so on in Europe's relationship with Russia. But more recently, I think we really go to the Biden administration period. And it coincided with a time when the European Union really had what they called a democracy gap. It wasn't democratic. It still isn't. But it was pretty obvious then that there was a democracy gap. But there was also an identity gap. Because, a technocracy doesn't give ordinary Europeans an identity. It's just, a thing that regulates. It's not something that you would go and sort of sacrifice for, the technocracy in Brussels. And then Biden started talking, if you recall, we had that image from Liberty Hall speech where it was all, bathed in dark red colors, and really it was quite sinister in its appearance, and deliberately made it sinister because then he produced a really very Manichaean speech, say, that the world was facing two evils. Autocracy was the main evil, but it was also that of Russia. And he dressed it up in very clear Manichaean language of dark and light, of good and evil. And then he repeated that in Warsaw in even more dramatic terms, talking about that this was a moment where you have to choose between good and evil and light the light. And of course, America always stood for the light. It was the sitting on the hill as a beacon to the world. And Russia was this dark force that had to be resisted. And there was a speech very shortly after by von der Leyen, and she almost parroted that speech. She said very much the same thing. This is light and dark and totally Manichaean terms. And I think what was happening in Europe was a number of things. That first of all, suddenly this provided Europe with its missing components. Here was something that could give them values. There wasn't a European value. I mean, if you ask an ordinary European, and I was part of the European Union, that what does Europe stand for? You'd have got, well, it was only 12 states then, but you'd have got many different answers about it. And here was a something that you could gather Europe around, if you like, a sort of good and evil value of fighting against autocracy, against tyranny, and in favor of the light and of progress and of a vision. I think that was then seized on as a sort of identity for Europe. Just as Ukraine, which is sort of a complementary part of this, has become the pole around which they've tried to forge European unity together, to try and bring it together in this form. And at that time, I mean, the Europeans were really fawning on Washington for this language and this type of thinking. And NATO was being pulled into this. At the same time, you had the German foreign minister, then Baerbock, actually going to give speeches in New York at this time, saying, Germany has given up the idea of change through trade. It wants weapons. It wants military muscle. It wants to be a part of your project. In other words, it proposed, and she said, at one time in the past, Obama had said, well, Germany and Washington could form a joint, if you like, military structure together. And she said, of course, it didn't happen. But this was her aim, was that Germany would be not so much part of a European structure, but totally connected into the Biden war machine at that time. And this, I think, has developed in the European Union over time, has developed. And, Manichaeism does have a sort of strain of messianism about it. And I think people have become really the European leaders have become quite messianic in this pursuit of, the light and fighting autocracy and the evil. And now they seem ready, and they talk about going to war against Russia. And you have all these sort of bizarre statements coming out from the German defense minister and others saying, well, there will be war with Russia by 2028. No, it may even be next year. And then we've just heard the Secretary General of NATO saying we have to prepare for a war that is going to be on a scale like our grandparents encountered, in other words, the First or Second World War. Well, this is bizarre. I mean, it makes no sense. And I think it is also highly dangerous. But this is what is happening, I think. And so we've had this, and this is why there were such screams of anxiety when this national strategic statement was produced by the United States, which suggested that NATO had an end date to it, and also took a very sharp swipe at Europe and its lack of values and its lack of democracy and its lack of legitimacy. And this was really a shock, and I think something that they, even though they knew there was tensions with the Trump administration, they didn't believe that they would be criticized quite in this way. So what we see, what is happening essentially is, that the NSS, the strategic statement, effectively undercuts the whole of that narrative of a Manichaean war of dark and light, because it said, no, a priority, American priority, is to restore stability with Russia, restore a stable relationship with Russia and a stable relation in Europe with Russia. Just the opposite of what they had tried to suggest and propose. And then it went further in the NSS, because this is the only glue that held the European Union together, Ukraine. And there, the NSS also said that we are working towards a solution on Ukraine. And so it cut everything away and left, the European elites, not the people of Europe, but the European elites, I mean, completely bereft of the identity that they wanted to cling on to the legitimacy of the whole project. Everything was being cut away in this MSF. And so they returned and pursued it with a sort of demonic zeal, was trying to go to extraordinary illegal lengths to try and steal the Russians. They're no longer frozen now. Russian sovereign funds that are held in Europe, and there's a tussle with America over this. So I think this is really why they have become so demonic about it. But it defies, and I don't think you can try and analyze it in terms of, secular rationalism. It's not. We're moving into something really, that has no. There are, of course, deep feelings of. There are quite sour feelings in Europe of a desire for revenge for what has happened to parts of Europe as a consequence of former wars with Russia. And that can't be denied too. But beyond that, I mean, we've seen this taking this front. And it's the only glue that holds the whole project together.
I always made the point that I think the EU is a bit more vulnerable to this Manichaeanism as well, because it's a good way of having unity among 27 member states. If everything is an issue of good and evil, dark versus light, then it's easier to herd everyone in the same direction. I mean, once you introduce different shades of gray, it's easier to begin to fragment along competing interests. But so just
and if it goes, I mean, if the Ukraine project it collapses, implodes, I mean, what is it that holds the European Union together, the 27 states? I mean, because, the idea was, first of all, it was going to be also guided by net zero and the move towards eliminating all forms of carbon from the system. And that was going to provide what was necessary, a different way of percolating money through the system, flooding the money through the system, which would help the banks and everything. They were desperately looking for some sort of structure, and they still are, that will provide, money and also provide the means for the European Union to go on spending if it goes on spending. So now they've sort of decided that the way to you like, restore their economy is by defense spending. Vast amounts of defense spending, they believe will improve the economy and stimulate growth in Europe. Well, of course, it doesn't. I mean, defense spending is notable. Yes, the shares of some of the defense companies will rise because there will be profits made. But what happens? You produce tanks, and unless there's a war, they stay in a warehouse, and they don't add to the, if you like, the the overall economic welfare of the community at all. The same with other uh, elements of it. So, the real economy is not really impacted. I mean, there may be a slight increase in employment, but there is not a great deal of, I think, a desire for most Europeans to go and work in an armaments factory. I mean, they're culturally not really adjusted to that, and they're not culturally not looking for war. So I'm not sure that this is a project that will either stimulate real economic growth. I mean, in a real economy, in the sense that gets to the heart of what men and women in Europe are looking for, which is well-paid jobs, money that can pay for medical care, schools, housing, all of these things which are becoming further and further out of reach. Just building weapons is not going to really produce that sort of increase in ordinary people's well-being at all, rather than the reverse. Because what it's going to do is attract capital away from, if you like, small businesses that are manufacturing things in Italy or in Germany. It will attract capital away. Capital has been going in this period increasingly to financial assets, but it attracts capital away from the small, lower level companies, because the companies will be directed by the government to put their money into, the big armaments structures.
But if this is one of the main drivers, though, that European elites feel that if they lose the war in Ukraine, then they will fall as well. Does this mean that all the new war rhetoric, that we have to be prepared, that our children should die in war, all this kind of very dark language, that this is not just rhetoric sending signals to the Russians? Do you think they would actually be willing to go to war? Because even if the intention is there, the capabilities, I mean.
They don't. They can't. They couldn't go to war. I mean, there isn't the money. The armories are empty. France and Britain, I mean, clearly don't have the means. Europe cannot produce, if you like, the manpower. For a war with Russia, you're talking about an army of 1 million or so. That's 1.5 million. I mean, this is not feasible. There is no money, there is no people, and there is no, if you like, nothing in the armories of Europe. It's just not practical. There are two other things that affect it. Is one, that young Europeans, in my view, are just not culturally thinking about going to war or wanting to go to war. They're more interested in what's going on in the soccer, or else, the latest fashion and what to wear and now. But they're not culturally adjusted to war. And they are, to be brutally frank, too soft to go to war in many ways. And I think by that I mean psychologically, not necessarily physically, but when you look at how many people have problems, mental problems in Europe, in Britain, it's It's 1 in 5 people who are out of work claim to be from depression or some sort of mental anxiety. So the last reason, which I think is it was an old saying, a Chinese saying, that this wise man went to the emperor and said, "What are the things you need to wage war, emperor?" And the emperor said, "Well, food, weapons, and trust." And the wise man said, "Well, if you only had one, which would you choose?" And he said, "Trust." Well, there's no trust in Europe. For would you send your children off to fight for Macron or Merz or Starmer? I don't think so. There's just no trust. Look at their standing in the polls. I mean, really catastrophic. So I don't think there's going to be really much sense. But where it's dangerous is because, um, uh, and I and I was in Moscow a couple of weeks ago for a week or so, and they understand what I've just said. I mean, and I think they would understand it in a um, in a very rational way, and they understand, that Europe could probably put at the absolute maximum, 100 to 100,000 men on the ground to fight, not nearly enough to fight a big army like Russia. They understand that, but they keep coming back to the question you posed. Why do we hear war, war, war? And I think they understand, therefore, that what we're talking about is not really war, not all out war, not war as, Ruther said, on our grandparents' scale with millions of peasants. What we're talking about is, if you like, a provocation, an attack that is designed to do something else. An attack, we saw the attack on the tankers in the Black Sea. We've seen all the complaints about, drones that are obviously Russian drones disturbing the airports, which have all turned out to be nonsense. And then, and then the threat of an aircraft flying, because it's a very narrow channel through the Baltics. And Estonia has a rock in it, which they claim to be part of their economic area. So it's very easy to sort of start a crisis. I mean, like the attacks on the tankers, and so that's. I mean, so what does this mean? What we're talking about really is we're talking about the Second World War, and we're talking about the efforts by Churchill and by Roosevelt, who was favor Green Plan, the Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor was the opportunity to bring America into the war against Germany. I think that the Europeans are hoping that they will have the incident, the shocking incident, the shock of a Pearl Harbor, that somehow will overwhelm Trump's objection and can pull America, not Europe, but I mean Europe with it, but America essentially, because it's not possible to take on Russia on the European element alone. And I think the problem that faces Russia is one I discussed some time ago when I was in Iran, is this, and it was really outlined to me by Abdullahian, who was the foreign minister, who was killed in that helicopter crash, if you recall, the leadership of Iran. And he was saying, and he was arguing that Iran had a very fine line to tread between deterrence and diplomacy. And you had to get it right, because if you did too much deterrence, you could provoke an aggressive response. But equally, if you did too much diplomacy, this would be seen as weakness and would result in a military response to exploit your weakness. So he said it's very fine. And I think, this is the debate that Russia has to have. Are do you immediately go up and threaten nuclear? Or do you find a sort of intermediate stage that you can go up the escalatory ladder, step by step, without having to go? You can go straight to the top and say, well, if this goes on, if you go on attacking our tankers in the Black Sea, we're going to use nuclear weapons or something like that. But I don't think Russia wants to do that. And I don't think Iran wants to in the same conflict. But it is a difficult balance. So we saw Putin doing that, I think, very clearly. And he said, if this continues, our first response will be to attack the ports of Ukraine in the Black Sea, and we will destroy those. The second stage to this is is that we will cut off Ukraine from, it will make it landlocked. We'll cut it off entirely from the Black Sea. And the third stage, which we would be reluctant to do, which would be to reciprocate to those Western states that we believe are behind these attacks on our shipping. So they are seeing going up in a very carefully constructed ladder. Now, what this brings into play, of course, is the deeper meaning of Trump's NSS, because for me, I think when you read it, it signifies a shift in the sort of thinking about war, a shift away from what you might call, if you like, the big symbolic military projects, the nuclear aircraft carriers, and towards a conflict which is designed to, if you like, prevent the alternative symbol, structure, and architecture of the alternative system to come into being. In other words, to determine what is next. Who is going to determine what is the system that comes next? Is it going to be Chinese type system, Russian type system, or is it going to be the free trade system of Adam Smith and America? And it was very interesting in the NSS. There was actually a reference to this. There was a swipe taken not just at Europe, but also at the free trade. Said this is what had undermined America and made it dependent on debt, the free trade system. And there was a sort of a glancing reference to the American system. The American system that was really a different system that was in the 19th century. And it attracted Trump's sort of comments because it was about tariffs, about protecting industries, about using a system to, if you like, protect yourself and get your industry to grow. And that is impossible to deploy in America. I mean, Trump can say it was a good system and it if you like, validates tariffs. But to actually go to it would take 20 years. I mean, this is what Russia did from 2007 after the Munich conference, changed towards, it wasn't an American system, even though for 150 years it had currency in America. It was the system of Friedrich List and Sergei Wittgenstein. principle, a very different one, not of an open economy, but of a closed economy with a small trading section. And this is, I think, going to be the struggle now, because China really has demonstrated that the alternative architecture works. I was in China for a week earlier this month, and it is really striking what they succeeded in doing. And it's not, I think, properly understood. I mean, not only in terms of industry, but what they have done is, first of all, they saw what was happening to Russia. They saw when the sanctions, when the tariffs were put on Russia, when the ruble was attacked by dropping the price of oil. At one point, it became actually a negative price of oil. They saw all these things, and like Putin, decided self-sufficiency is the only answer to this. We have to be completely self-sufficient, and we have to get away from dependency on the United States. And they've done that. And really, they're dependent only on a few things like aircraft and certain ships and certain things, but largely they are not. And in fact, they reversed it because it's now America that is more dependent on Chinese supply lines than Chinese are dependent on American components. So they've made themselves self-sufficient. But really the important story, and the one that I don't think is understood so much, is the AI. They haven't gone down the American route of big data centers. I mean, they told me, and they were very clear, and they said, look, the American AI was based on military needs, targeting, identifying hostile targets, and then attacking Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza. We all know how it's been used in this way, AI, to determine who in Gaza might have some connection with Hamas from telephone calls and from movement analysis. All of this required huge data centers, massive of data. And the Chinese say, but what are the Americans going to do when they got all the data? I mean, it's not necessarily good data. We see that some of it's wrong. But what are you going to do when you do this? We've done something different, the Chinese would say. We have actually diffused AI into a simple application to industry. It is really, in a sense, a sort of form of automation and robotics. And that this has transformed industry. I talked to one very large industrialist who had many factories, and he was telling me, you cannot imagine how a simple application of AI at the practical industrial level, not of the big data center, not as the big compute start level, has changed it. He said, for example, I took, I've had many factories. If I take one which, say, as an example, which employed 2,000 people last year, is deploying 200 this year. He said, this is the scale of the technical shift that is taking place. Of course, one implication of that is Chinese unemployment. But as their growth was at about 6% in China in the last quarter, he was confident that most people will get jobs. But but really the shocker was when he said, what this has done for China is we actually have price deflation because our industries are now so much more efficient and competitive. We are moving in a path of price deflation. And you, the West, are in inflation cycle. And the meaning was obvious. How does the West sell to China when it's made such a huge change in its competitiveness? I don't see how it's going to be possible to do that. So they are in a very strong position, and I think feel quite confident in that position. So when you look at that, they look again at the West and its huge investment of AI, and they say, we believe there was a big gathering and discussion about AI just before. Well, I was there just before that, and the gist of it was really a sort of sense that the West has got this totally wrong. They'll never have the revenue from these big data centers. We can see that, obviously. They're not going to get the revenue to justify this expenditure. And what you're doing in the West with this is actually you're starving a small factories, small businesses of the investment, because all of the debt is now being owed and all the money being channeled towards, the magnificent step up, the big AI giants of the United States. But you don't have revenue. And the point he was making is, industrialists said, look at me. I mean, I put, if you like, diffused a sort of working level AI, and I have revenue. I'm selling more. I'm selling across Asia and to Europe. So I have real revenue that I can identify from AI. You don't have revenue. And the other striking thing is that they've created a whole financial ecosphere around it at a different level, so that you have, everything is run by the apps and things that, and Western apps don't work by and large. But you have something like WeChat. It has more than 1 billion Chinese using it. 1 billion. And Alipay also, because sometimes they overlap. So they have financial sphere. And of course, AI is being, through Alibaba and the Amazon of China, sort of being brought into this process too. So they're going to get revenue in both ways. And they're going to get revenue because they've gone down the route of a different form of AI, which is open source, and other states can use it. And it's much more adaptable, and it's simpler because it's not based on huge mega giant hangars full of computers, as in the Western system. This is the main, this is the, if you like, the great achievement, self-sufficiency. They have got a highly competitive position. It's they have the leverage, and we've lost it. I mean, put it bluntly, they have the leverage in all these sorts of ways, and they'll have more leverage because at the end of the day, they believe, I'm not an expert in AI, but they strongly believe their approach to AI is going to be the one that will dominate across Asia and across the BRICS, and the Western one, with its heavy burden of data and sensors, will just consume too much investment and will finally crash and burn. We will see, but that's why they're very confident. And so, how does this relate today? Well, I think Venezuela shows you how it relates at the moment, because Maduro in the summer, this last summer, made an offer to Trump, which was unprecedented. I mean, he said, "You can, I will open up gold mining, oil, all our resources to American company participation in the economy. I will do all of that. You can invest and in the oil industry, and you can invest in everything. And it was really a complete sacrifice of, if you like, Venezuela's resources and sovereignty. You can have everything. You can be participant in everything. Some American companies were in, never left Venezuela, but one particular. But this was an offer. And what did they get from Trump? And he said this publicly, but not explained it. Hard no. No. Well, why would he do this? Why would Trump say no when he could get everything that reports to want, which is, the resources of Venezuela to back up, the over-leveraged financial system of America, to take all these resources and American companies swimming back in and taking them. Why would he say no? And the answer, I think, is that actually also written in the NSS, where they state we're moving to an era of zones of influence, if you like, areas of influence. And in the NSS, it's clear that Latin America and the Americas as a whole are going to be America's sphere of influence. And it's going to pretty well take them. I mean, it's going to be part of the United States interest. And the rest of it, Europe and Asia and the Middle East, is to be franchised out to allies in various places, and with a fee for the franchise operation going to America, the money that they were required to pay their debts. But what this is about was that in the NSS, it says that it will be only one, if you like, company in the areas where they have leverage and control. America, this paragraph says, and we will push out any infrastructure that belongs to another power. And of course, in November, what happened was Venezuela signed a deal at the Shanghai Expo with China, zero tariff deal, and also one of a private Chinese company, not a state company, but a private one, agreed to do a 20-year investment in the Venezuelan economy, in its oil company, and dealing with all of the fields, many of the fields, huge investment, people on the ground, people providing it. It would be a different, really a huge investment by China. And that was signed at the Shanghai Expo. What does this mean then? What really are we seeing is that Trump is saying, look, these Chinese, it's not about oil. Oil is fungible. And he said no to the deal Maduro offered. He said, no, sorry, I'm not going to do it. Instead of which he assembled a flotilla of ships. What he's saying is, we are not going to have this infrastructure. The infrastructure specific in the NSA. We will not allow the infrastructure of others in our spheres of interest. We're not going to have Chinese loans. We're not going to have, if you like, Chinese tech. We're not going to accept Chinese corridors. We're not going to accept Chinese building ports and other infrastructure. We're going to pull that out and take it out. And we are going to it will be American infrastructure. This is the new, if you like, architecture, the model. Our model is going to be the American model and not the Chinese model. This is the war of architecture. They want to keep it to the American architecture and to not permit, if you like, this alternative model to get a grip into Latin America. And they're going to enforce this elsewhere. So what are all those ships doing? Well, I don't know whether they're going to attack Venezuela or not. I slightly doubt it. I think it's there to stop and to break the infrastructure of China, Russia, and Iran that is already quite deeply embedded into Venezuela. The other sort of infrastructure, if you like, the soft infrastructure, building ports, giving credit, not requiring political changes in the states they go to. This is a tactic because, the states that adopt this type of architecture are not required, if you like, to follow American foreign policy dictates. They're not required to pursue the they are required to pursue the dollar. And in the Chinese one, they're not. There's an alternative financial system. And that's why it was so clear to me when I was in China. Look, that system that I described to you, WeChat and Alipay and everything, they could unfold it across the whole of Central Asia like that. I mean, it's there. It's scaled up to 1 billion people using it in China. You could scale it across Central Asia. I don't think without much problems, but they're doing it very gently and carefully. So this is, I think, the next phase of the conflict. Not so much the mega, symbols, aircraft carriers and, all of the paraphernalia of the old war. But how do you stop and how do you ensure what is the next economic model for the world? Is it going to be the, if you like, Bretton Woods model with all this coercion, the IMF, World Bank, use of the dollar hedge fund, or do you go to a Chinese one, and with its different systems of payments, different systems of operating, different understandings of how an economy is actually to be managed to produce the wealth of the people, not to be a servant that the markets, if you like, dominate the economy, but the markets are the servant of the government, not the dominant part. We'll have to see, but I think this is going to be the struggle next in this period. And so what happens with Venezuela, could be very serious because I don't think China is just going to say, oh, okay, well, fine, and walk away, because this is going to be very symbolic for the future, very symbolic for BRICS, very symbolic for what other countries will look at and say, well, this is important. So that's where I think we're heading to this sort of, if you like, different type of war. Because Trump is trying to, he said it first of all at his speech in Riyadh, but he said it, it's written in the NSS. He's trying to move towards transactional business geopolitics based on business. What does that mean? Well, I think in terms of Ukraine, we see very clearly that Witkoff and Kushner and now BlackRock are involved are trying to devise a system where everybody, gets a piece of the cake, gets the financial, the reconstruction of Ukraine, whoever finally pays for it. It will be divided up so that the sort of stakeholders all can get a piece of this action one way. I mean, it's a very, we can all guess the origins of this is exactly how real estate is managed in New York. You've got a piece of land and maybe someone who's going to prevent you from building a big tower there, got another piece of land and you want to, pay off that stakeholder, and the other stakeholder will be the, the local authorities and so on. So you build a sort of structure where everyone gets a bit of something, and then it can be done. But the trouble is that, I don't think Ukraine is like that. I mean, that it's not, yes, there are financial interests. We know that money it's a boondoggle, like Afghanistan was, with money going, taxpayer money goes to this, to Ukraine or whatever, and some of it somehow circulates back in terms of campaign donations and other forms. And it's the same in Europe as well. Yes, there is that part, but there's something more. Russia wants a watertight security architecture for the for Europe, not a deal, not a financial deal. They want that. Europe wants to make sure that Russia is defeated and humiliatingly defeated, and if it will not be a future actor in Europe again, one needs to be weakened so that it cannot be an actor. And of course, Russia wants to see NATO severely defeated, so that it will not simply come back and start rebuilding in Ukraine. So you have, the Trump business approach taking place. And then you have, if you like, the real politic, real politic part of it, which is, what are the actual needs of Russia and of Europe, and why are you determined to block any progress with this plan to have if you like, a financialized, benefit for all, out of large sums of money. Recall that America has already said that it would like some of the frozen Russia, 100 billion from that piece, and we will use it for reconstruction in Ukraine. And of course, we'll take 50% of the profits, or BlackRock will, or whoever. And the fact that BlackRock is now engaged in these negotiations. So you have the negotiations that are just run by businessmen. There is no one actually, who is there, who is writing a legally binding, detailed, carefully prepared, carefully drafted peace proposal. It's a deal, not a proper legal treaty. That's what Russia wants, and at the moment, it hasn't got that.
It's an interesting thing, though, when there's a fast economic development. Countries are afraid to fall behind, so you often find a lot of malinvestments taking place. But I very much agree, though. I think the inability to compete with China, the response by the US appears to be to carve out these exclusive economic regions where they don't have to compete with China, as they would like to set up also with Venezuela. But the Europeans, though, they don't really have many of these options. They don't have the technological sovereignty of the Americans. They don't have the ability to set up these exclusive zones. So, well, given that you spoke before about trust, the lack of trust, what do you think the possible political consequences could be in Europe now? Because there is there's a bit of an irony here. That is, if we would make peace with the Russians, that is to address the underlying causes. That is a European security architecture. If we can end these dividing lines in Europe, the bloc politics, Europe could actually prosper if we spent more of our efforts on perhaps cooperating with Russia. But instead, well, Chas Freeman, he made a point that we might be facing a pre-revolutionary moment in Europe, because there's been so much marginalization of the opposition, the media, now with these growing economic problems you referred to, and our leaders more or less saying we have to prepare for war with Russia, and all of these lies over the past few years which are being exposed. Did you see this, just as a last question, do you see the possibility of massive political upheaval due to, yeah, I guess a crisis in political legitimacy, or is that too strong?
Oh, I think if anything, it's understated. Absolutely. I mean, the European leadership have put Europe in a catastrophic situation. I mean, you know the details, and people watching this, I'm sure. I mean, you know, the business model of Europe has collapsed. The standard of living of Europeans is collapsing. There's huge tension with other aspects, with immigration, and there are no all the bridges, the political bridges out have been destroyed deliberately by the European Union and their insistence on a cordon sanitaire that just the center parties, often minorities. I mean, you know, the NSS was quite right on that. I mean, it is neither democratic, nor particularly legitimate. And the whole process, I mean, has been so badly handled that Europe faces a catastrophic situation. It's on bad terms with China, it's on bad terms with Russia, it's on bad terms with America and with this administration. I know they may be hoping that there'll be a new president, you know, quite soon. But, you know, hope isn't a strategy. And meanwhile, they've given up energy. And in return for highly expensive liquid natural gas from America. It's a disaster. And I think the answer to your question is what do you do? I mean, I think it's very obvious what happens. It is that if you protest in Europe, you will be suppressed and violently suppressed. I mean, you saw what happened in Paris at the protests. All of it is clearly a concerted, deliberate plan to not allow protests. Protests are reacted with violence, quite strong violence. I think the French have got something like 80,000 at one point of anti-riot police fighting and protests. I mean, this is war, not. I mean, that doesn't sound like policing. And the same, it's just not reported. But there are protests and there are strikes in places like Italy, not reported, hardly covered in the press. Whole, you know, Italy shut down. And so not too violent, but some violence in it. And if protests don't work, if forming an alternative opposition party doesn't work, look what's happened to them. They've all been, you know, branded as far right or facing bans, or their leaders are being targeted and under lawfare or some form of corruption. I mean, whether we take it in Romania or Moldova or France, all of these, you know, you start a party that is not in the within the cordon sanitaire, and the leaders will be, you know, attacked, will be corrupt or outside of the law. So if protests don't work, if voting doesn't work, if you only have Tweedledum and Tweedledee to vote for, what's the point of that? So as things get worse, and people get poor, and life becomes very intolerably hard for them, yes, they will turn to insurrection.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time. It's no, it's not a fun time in in Europe anymore. It's just I wouldn't really wanted to ask about this because every time I speak to anyone, the main question is always, what are the Europeans doing? Because there's always some understanding for the Americans. They can understand the Russians, they can understand the Ukrainians, but the Europeans are always a bit of an enigma, which is a good indication that they might not, that is European leaders acting in their own national interests. But
And because they're desperate. I mean, they're going to lose everything by having made these bad decisions. They're going to, lose the one thing, the glue that held the European Union together. They're going to lose their credibility. They lost their business model. They faced financial, fiscal crisis, and collapsing standards of living of their electorates. It's it's my very enviable situation. No wonder they are doubling down in their desperation, hoping against hope that something will turn up and that Trump will be sort of change his view and will come and save them from what they must surely expect is going to be a very uncomfortable period.
well, thanks again.
Thank you.